So I was feeling pretty damn good that afternoon, to be honest. I usually hate business trips, hate driving home alone, but something felt different that day. So I had wrapped things up early, a few hours ahead of schedule, and all I could think about was surprising Claire. There was this seafood place we used to love going to when we were still in the honeymoon phase of our marriage. I hadn't made reservations. We used to be so spontaneous. I figured I'd play it by ear, pick her up and see if she was in the mood to relive old memories. Maybe it would spark something. We'd been in this weird rut lately, like two roommates playing house more than an actual married couple. Work had been stressful, sure, but it always had been. I didn't think it was the reason things felt off between us. Maybe we just needed more time together. That was the logic I used anyway. I took a familiar shortcut, one I'd driven countless times before. I wasn't even really paying attention, just zoning out, thinking how she'd react when I walked through the door early and told her to dress up. That's when I saw it, Claire's car. Same make, same color, even the sticker on the rear window, only it wasn't in our driveway or some spot downtown. It was parked outside this random house, something suburban, but a little too perfect in an area I didn't recognize. Slowing down, I found myself staring at it like an idiot. The engine hummed, but I didn't even hear it then. I just sat there watching, piecing things together for a moment. Maybe she was visiting a friend. But the longer I looked, the more uneasy I felt. This wasn't near where her friends lived. This was some completely unknown part of town. I grabbed my phone, thumb hovering over her contact, feeling briefly ridiculous for getting worked up over nothing. She was probably just running errands. A quick call would clear it up. It's a good thing I hadn't rushed to any stupid conclusions. Hit dial. The ringing seemed to stretch forever, and when she picked up, Claire's voice came through smooth, familiar, like every normal day. "Hey, where are you?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "Oh, just out running errands," she replied easily, like we were talking about laundry. No hesitation, no stumble in her words. If anything, she sounded distracted, like it was no big deal. That settled knot deep in my stomach tightened. I glanced back at her car. Errands don't bring you to the middle of nowhere. I kept it cool, muttered something about coming home early and wanting to surprise her. She made some excuse, sounded so normal too, talking about picking up some things for the house, running late, promising she'd be back soon. Her voice never wavered once. We said our goodbyes, and I stared at my screen for a long second after the call ended. The house in front of me didn't look like the kind of place you stop by for errands. Something didn't sit right. The worst part was the way she didn't sound nervous at all. It was like she'd been telling that lie for a while now, comfortable enough to spin it without a hitch. Maybe 5 seconds of silence felt like 5 minutes at that moment. I knew driving away was the only option. What else was I supposed to do? Confront her in front of some stranger's house? Blow up over something I wasn't even sure of yet? I needed to think. I needed more solid ground than just a gut feeling. But my gut was already way ahead of me. I pulled away from the curb and headed back home, but something was gnawing at me. That house, her car, nothing made sense anymore. Halfway home, my mind spiraled into territory I didn't want to tread, but the idea was already there, stuck in my head like an itch I couldn't reach. All I could do was hope I was wrong. Over the next few days, things shifted between us. Claire wasn't acting the same, or maybe it just took me this long to start noticing it. The little things she did without thinking. These new weird habits I couldn't ignore even if I tried. Normally she was glued to her phone, we both were, responding to emails, group chats, social media nonsense. But now, every time I walked into a room, her phone disappeared like magic. I wasn't even looking for it, but even without thinking I noticed it happen. She'd be scrolling like usual, and just like that, the screen would go dark the second I got near. At first I told myself it was nothing. I mean, why would she need to hide something? But it crept under my skin. Started making these casual moments between us feel tense, intentional or not. It felt like she was pulling away. Maybe if I hadn't seen her car by that house, I wouldn't be as paranoid about everything that came after. But I had. Now, all the small things were stacking up into something bigger. Conversations with her became flat, empty. I'd say something about work, how this meeting went or how the team messed up that project's deadline, and she'd nod along, giving just enough of a response to seem engaged. But her mind wasn't with me. She'd laugh, say all the right things, but I could feel this wall growing between us, something cold. She started talking about how busy she was too, how work had been crazy, suddenly now swamped with late nights, which left me with more empty hours at home, alone, just sitting there staring at her side of the couch. Each night felt like her phone buzzed more than usual, and each time she was quick to grab it before I got a look at it. Was I being paranoid? It was like there was a tiny part of me still resisting the full plunge into suspicion. What I wanted to believe it was all in my head, wanted it to be stress or just a passing rough patch. But every locked glance at her phone, every awkward shift of conversation, it all stacked higher. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I wasn't ready to accuse her of something I didn't even want to admit to myself. But my attempts to keep things normal fell flat. I was pulling away without even meaning to. I stopped kissing her goodbye before leaving for work, skipped the small talk in the mornings, so my patience for her late nights thinned with each passing day as the reasons behind them jawed at the back of my mind. I got home that night, after my gut-wrenching discovery, feeling like the life had been drained out of me. I moved through the house in a daze, trying to process the images seared into my brain, Claire laughing and looking so warm with Nick, in a way I hadn't seen from her in longer than I could remember. Over the next few days, I became an expert at feigning normalcy while gathering evidence of a betrayal. For every time Claire claimed she was working late, I silently trailed her served to that same unassuming house in the suburbs. Night after night, her car was there, windows dark, as she carried on her affair in secret. I no longer looked at Claire the way I used to. How could I, when I now knew the depths of her deception? Our conversations were hollow, any tenderness or intimacy we once shared withered by this new cloud of distrust hanging over us. I responded in clipped sentences when she spoke, no longer meeting her eyes. If she sensed the growing distance, she didn't let on. Claire seemed to relish in those supposed late nights more than ever before. I'd wait up, my jaw clenched, imagining her and Nick tangled together while I sat stewing alone. As the nights dragged on, any sadness I initially felt hardened into a cold, simmering rage. She didn't even have the decency to admit her unfaithfulness, just carried on the charade like I was a fool. I knew it was coming, and yet, when the moment arrived, the reality still hit like a gut punch. Sitting there at the kitchen table, I could hear the ticking of the clock. Each second dragged. Shadows from the kitchen lamp played across the walls, casting elongated shapes that made everything feel more surreal. Claire came through the door, barely giving me a glance as if tonight was the same as any other. She slipped off her heels, sighing like she was finally home from a long day of work, like I hadn't been piecing together her lies for weeks. It took everything in me to not respond with something biting. Every picture of them together in my mind, every moment I sat alone questioning myself, all that noise felt like it was boiling up to the surface, but I didn't snap. How was work? That was all I asked, nearly monotone, as she moved towards the fridge like she hadn't just ripped apart the last decade we had together. Claire glanced back at me, probably startled by how still I was. Usually on the couch or passed out before she got in this late. Tonight, I wasn't playing pretend. It was fine, she said with that plastic smile. Her voice dipped in a lightness as if she hadn't just come from fucking Nick. My stomach churned. The way she said those words, so casual, a routine lie now. I pushed my chair back slightly, the sound scraping against the old wood floor. Her gaze lingered on me longer this time, probably feeling something shift in the air between us. I didn't dance around it anymore. I couldn't. Were you with Nick again? I watched her falter. There it was. Her eyes widened just enough before she quickly tried to compose herself. I could almost see the mental scramble happening behind her eyes. She swallowed hard, that smile completely disappearing, replaced by something hollow. It was like watching a mask crack open, her whole polished exterior giving way. Matt, what? Why would you even? Claire fumbled for words, the same way someone does when they know they've fucked up but they're grasping at anything, even lies, to dig themselves out. It's nothing like that, it's just Nick needed help with something personal. It's work-related. She couldn't look me in the eye. She focused on some imaginary stain on the countertop instead, hoping that maybe if she avoided my eyes long enough, I'd just let the whole thing die down, like usual. But I was past that. Your car was at his house. I didn't wait for her to respond this time. Twice. And I'm guessing that wasn't about financial reports, for my voice was flat, cold even to my own ears. If fire ever burned inside me for Claire, it had become something brittle and sharp, like glass ready to break apart. Her denial unraveled fast. No, Matt, I swear you don't understand, it wasn't serious. She took a step closer, reaching for me with those hands I once loved without question. Now, it just made me sick. It didn't mean anything. Didn't mean anything? I repeated, because I couldn't fucking believe that was what she was going with. I stood up, finally meeting her face to face. Then why all the lying? The late nights, sneaking around, till I couldn't keep my voice even anymore. My jaw clenched tight, and it took every ounce of restraint to not shout at her the way I wanted to. She stood frozen, those green eyes wide with guilt, confused panic rolling off her. Matt, please, she started to cry, her voice cracking. It was a mistake, it was just a stupid mistake. Her words came out between shaky breaths now, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the hem of her blouse. I love you, I swear I do, she was practically begging. But something in me snapped. Love? This? No, this wasn't love. What she was fighting for wasn't us, it was control. It was her desperately trying to hold together the illusion we'd built. My fist clenched tight, nails digging into my palms. No sympathy, no forgiveness stirred inside me. Just a hollow, bitter sense of finality. It doesn't matter, Claire. The words felt heavy as I pushed them out, each one clipped, cooler than the air between us. You lied. You cheated. There's nothing to save here. She fucking wailed at that. I cut through every excuse she'd rehearsed in her mind. She kept mumbling through sobs, saying she'd fix it, do whatever it would take, promising all kinds of things that once, years ago, might have seeped in and held me there. I watched as she crumbled further, falling apart in front of me like we hadn't spent the last 10 years building this life together. But it meant absolutely nothing now. None of her words reached me. I was too far gone. So I didn't say another word. I turned, walked up the stairs, all while her broken cries filled the space behind me, as if I didn't hear them or care. In this moment, I didn't care. I packed my things quickly, with a numbness that felt surreal. Clothes, a couple of work essentials, wallet, the bare minimum. So I came down the stairs, the sound of Claire still choking on her apologies, still sitting there, barefoot now, just defeated, dying in her mess. Part of me had expected this to feel final or brutal, but it just felt empty. Like a long overdue obligation, so I didn't even look at her again before I grabbed my bag and walked out. The door shut quietly behind me. And the house felt foreign. It didn't feel like my home anymore. I didn't register much as I drove to Jake's. Just headlights passing by, streetlights reflecting on the windshield. My thoughts were heavy, disjointed, but that numbness remained the whole way there. So I pulled into his driveway and just sat in the car. No music, no sound, just sitting with my head pressed against the back of the seat, eyes shut. After a few minutes, I dragged myself out, knocked on his door. It took Jake only seconds to answer, probably half asleep but wide awake when he saw my face. There was no need for a question. He just nodded, walked me inside without a word. The weight of what just happened didn't fully drop until I crashed onto his couch. He handed me a beer, and I drank half of it before setting it down. The kitchen clock ticked, like the one at home, but somehow this clock felt less suffocating. Neither of us spoke, but the silence was the weird kind of comforting. Like somehow Jake understood that words weren't what I needed right now. What could explain anything, really? 2 hours passed. The beer tasted bitter by the time I finished it. Every few minutes a curse would slip, offhand, breaking the quiet. Jake, barely looking at me, just muttered his agreement, his presence grounding me in its own way. Still, everything felt shattered. I woke up the next morning on Jake's couch, my head pounding from a sleepless night. The reality of what had happened hit me like a freight train. Without hesitation, I grabbed my phone and blocked Claire's number. I couldn't bear to hear her voice, her excuses, her lies. Work became my refuge. I buried myself in spreadsheets and meetings, grateful for anything that could occupy my mind. But even as I threw myself into projects, the pain gnawed at me, a constant ache in my chest. Claire, though, she wasn't giving up. My phone started buzzing with calls from unknown numbers. I ignored them at first, but curiosity got the better of me. I listened to one voicemail, and a tearful voice filled my ear. Matt, please, we need to talk. I'm so sorry, I love you. Please call me back. I deleted it immediately, feeling sick to my stomach, but they kept coming. Different numbers, same desperate pleas. It was like she was haunting me. Her presence lingering, even though I'd walked away. But then she took it further. My phone lit up with texts from our friends. Hey man. Claire reached out. She's really torn up. Maybe you should hear her out? Matt, I know you're hurting, but don't you think you're being a bit harsh? It made my blood boil. She was trying to manipulate the narrative, to paint herself as the victim. I wanted to scream, to tell everyone the truth, but I held back. I wouldn't stoop to her level. As days turned into weeks, the pressure mounted. It felt like everyone had an opinion on my marriage, on what I should do. Claire's sister called, her voice syrupy sweet as she tried to guilt me into meeting with Claire. Even my own parents suggested I give her another chance. Marriage is about forgiveness, my mum said gently. I wanted to laugh. Forgiveness? For what? For Claire destroying everything we'd built together, for making a fool of me. Every conversation became a minefield. I found myself withdrawing, avoiding social gatherings where I knew I'd face an onslaught of well-meaning but misguided advice. The isolation was suffocating, but it was better than constantly defending my decision. In those quiet moments alone, I started to find myself again. I took on extra projects at work, throwing myself into challenges that demanded all my focus. My boss noticed, praising my dedication in our weekly meetings. On a whim, I dug out my old basketball from the back of the closet. The familiar weight in my hands brought back memories of simpler times. I found a local league and signed up, relishing the physical exertion, the way it allowed me to shut off my brain for a few hours. I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. An unknown number flashed on the screen. My finger hovered over the reject button, ready to send it to voicemail. But something made me pause. I answered. "Hello?" "Matt, it's me." Claire's voice hit me like a punch to the gut. My pulse quickened, body tensing for the emotional onslaught I'd come to expect. But it didn't come. "I think we should sell the house," she said, her tone surprisingly calm and businesslike. I blinked, caught off guard. Of all the things I'd imagined her saying, this wasn't one of them. "Okay," I replied cautiously. "That makes sense." "Great. I'll have my lawyer draw up the paperwork." "Fine. Everything should go through the lawyers from now on." A brief silence hung between us. I could almost hear the unspoken words, the history we shared, crackling across the line, but I pushed those thoughts away. "All right then. Goodbye, Matt." The call ended, leaving me staring at my phone. A mix of emotions churned inside me, relief that it wasn't another plea for forgiveness, frustration that her voice still affected me, and a strange emptiness I couldn't quite place. I tossed my phone aside and rubbed my face, trying to shake off the lingering effects of hearing her voice. It was just business now. Nothing more. The next few weeks passed in a blur of paperwork and legal jargon. I threw myself into work, grateful for the distraction. But as I sat in the lawyer's office, pen poised over the final documents, reality hit me hard. 10 years. A decade of memories, arguments, laughter, and love, all distilled down to a stack of papers and a signature. My hand shook slightly as I signed my name, officially ending the life Claire and I had built together. I watched as the lawyer gathered the documents, feeling oddly detached. There was no longing for what we'd had, no desire to turn back time, just a quiet acceptance that this chapter of my life was truly over. The realtor met me at the house one last time. I walked through the empty rooms, footsteps echoing off bare walls. Her memories flashed through my mind, painting the living room, arguing over furniture placement, lazy Sunday mornings in bed, but they felt distant now, like scenes from someone else's life. I handed over the keys, a small piece of metal that suddenly felt impossibly heavy. The realtor smiled, congratulating me on the sale. I nodded, managing a small smile in return. As I walked away, I felt both liberated and strangely hollow. The last tie binding me to Claire had been severed. Driving away from the house for the last time, I realized I was truly on my own now. No more shared responsibilities, no more compromises. Just me forging my own path forward. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. I pulled over, needing a moment to process. Leaning my head against the steering wheel, I took a deep breath. The pain of Claire's betrayal still lingered, a dull ache in my chest, but it no longer consumed me. I was stronger now, tempered by the fire of this experience. Looking up, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. The man staring back at me had changed. There was a new hardness in his eyes, but also a glimmer of hope. I wasn't bitter anymore, just determined to build a better life for myself. As I pulled back onto the road, I felt weight lift from my shoulders. The future stretched out before me, full of possibilities. For the first time in months, I felt truly free. Whatever came next, I knew I could handle it. I was ready to embrace my new beginning.